Okay, you guys are live.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. This is the September 14th, 2022 meeting of the Southborough ZBA. Tonight's meeting has just one agenda item on it, and that is discussion of comprehensive permits for 40B hosted by Southborough Town Council, Mr. Jay Talman. So I think that's pretty much where we're going to start. Mr. Talman, I'd say the agenda is yours, whatever it is that you have for us to present or discuss. I think we're open to the floor is open to you.
Great. So before I get started, has anyone either been on the board during a 40B or has otherwise have firsthand experience in 40Bs? Craig? Paul? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So some of this is going to be old grounded. I think, I could sit here and talk. I've done a lot of 40B work over the years. I could sit here and talk about 40B and go through a timeline, but it'll work best if you kind of interrupt and ask questions and kind of let's make this more of a conversation rather than me just talking about it. I will sit up here and talk for a while, but happy to have diversions and talk about little problem areas. As everyone knows, where we may or may not, but we may receive an application for a fairly sizable 40B, kind of Park Central 2. It is at the beginning of the process in this second go around. That beginning starts with their request for project eligibility. Project eligibility is one of the three prerequisites of applying. Prior to applying to the Zoning Board of Appeals, you have to have project eligibility from a subsidizing agency. That's the subsidy. There's not really a financial subsidy to that. And you have to control the property, which is pretty clear here. And then you have to essentially pledge to limit your profit at the end of the day. And before I start there, does anyone need a basic primer on what 40B is at all? I mean, I'm happy to go way back to the beginning and kind of explain where the statute came from. So everyone's at least familiar a little bit with some of the contours. 40B has been around since 1969. It was developed to provide kind of a carrot approach to the privatization of affordable housing. It is somewhat, in my opinion, as someone who represents mostly cities and towns, but sometimes developers, but mostly cities and towns, kind of gone astray a little. It essentially turns zoning discretion on its head. Normally, a zoning board has all the authority and or a planning board and can deny or condition or approve a project at its whim and feel reasonably confident in the outcome of that decision. The balance is shifted here where the presumptions go in favor of the 40B applicant with respect to waivers or requested waivers of local bylaws to satisfy what is normally a higher density project or at least a project that's might not otherwise be allowed. Okay. So I left off. So before the applicant can get to you, they've got to get project eligibility. Project eligibility is somewhat of a rubber stamp in that the subsidizing agencies don't really that closely scrutinize a project. On very rare occasions, they might say no to a project, but the approval rate by the subsidizing agencies is well over 90%, and they almost invariably and without much in the way of comment or requirements or restrictions gleefully approve the projects and send them on to the Zoning Board of Appeals. That said, we're in the process of the project eligibility phase where the town is preparing comments to the subsidizing agency, asking them to focus on certain things, and maybe that will spur some amount of scrutiny on the project that you may face before you. And I'm not really here to talk about the project specifically, although I guess we could talk about it a little bit because it's all going to be before you sooner or later, likely. So after an applicant gets project eligibility, they apply to the zoning board. The zoning board has 30 days upon the receipt of that application to schedule a public hearing on that. It used to be kind of a lengthy public hearing without any required end. The regulations have changed on that, and you have essentially 6 months to conduct your public hearing. Usually, or for complex projects, it's not unusual for the 6 months to be extended by the applicant if things are moving towards an approval, or if the applicant has dragged their feet, then there are some extensions possible, but essentially 6 months, which seems like a long time, but when you meet perhaps once a month and you have to act as every other permit granting board in the town under local bylaws, whether that be the zoning bylaws, subdivision by regulations, local wetlands, local Board of Health regulations, approvals that may be issued for water, sewer, drainage, stormwater, tree permits, demolition, all of that stuff now is laid at your feet, and you are the permit granting authority. So the application will be pretty comprehensive, and your review can be pretty comprehensive. And like any other application, you are entitled to get the benefit of peer review consultants at the applicant's expense, engineers, traffic consultants, wetlands consultants, stormwater people, any other range of experts. You're also going to be able to rely on town staff. And I'm also prepared to be with you or someone from the firm at the very least with you for every evening of the public hearing and to help you out along the way. So any questions on what we do and how we get to the zoning board before I kind of move on to the process itself? Okay. So generally we start in pretty regular fashion with these projects. An applicant, we usually let them the first night of the hearing, just kind of, it's usually an abbreviated affair. We tell them, go ahead and make a brief presentation on this. Usually then the board may have some questions. And you're free to ask questions, and you're free to not ask questions or make comments at that point. You don't have to be shy, but you can be reserved as reserved as you like. We usually end that first session with a request to have the applicant be prepared to write a bunch of checks for peer review. My recommendation usually is that the board delegate one person or the town planner or some other entity in town the authority to locate and get proposals from peer review consultants. Most certainly we will need a civil engineering firm and a traffic consultant. Even though this project is in somewhat similar form to its prior iteration, it's new enough and this board is new enough that we're entitled to all of that review over again. And you can choose the same engineer that was used in the past, or you could use a different engineer. And usually in between those two sessions, the board will, or the designated member will endeavor to hire some folks, and they will begin to review plans in engineering. So that will then tip us into the kind of general back and forth. Of course, at each session of the hearing, you may choose to allow public comment. You don't have to allow public comment invariably at each session, but normally it's a good practice to allow at least some public comment. This is obviously a project that is going to generate a significant amount of public input and likely be attorneys representing the public on that. So it's fair to say that people will want to have their choice to be recognized. Like any public hearing where there's public comment, there's likely going to be some repetition. I leave it to the chair how they want to kind of structure that. If they feel that we're getting repetitive or people are going on too long, you have the authority to do that. But again, it's going to certainly generate a lot of public interest. And then from that point, for the next several sessions, it's really going to be kind of discussions by their engineers and our engineers and their traffic consultant and our traffic consultant with the board asking questions. I do think the board should also schedule a site visit at some point, go out and see the site. But the next few sessions are likely going to be dominated by very technical matters, unless some kind of oddball issue arises that requires some kind of legal analysis or some other factual analysis. The sessions 2, 3, 4 of your hearing are going to be dominated by experts quibbling about traffic counts and traffic calming and mitigation and other items there. As the project begins to take shape, you'll have an opportunity, and it's encouraged, it's not required, to engage the applicant on things that you might think need to be changed or what they could do to mitigate impacts. You don't have to do that. You could love the project as is, or you can dislike the project in its entirety. That's all out there in front of you. But if you do start to arrive at things that you would like to see changed, then kind of midway through the project, you have an opportunity, and again, there's some encouragement to do that. Let's say, for example, that you think all the buildings are too high, and you came with a request like, could you drop a story from each of the however many buildings there are? And the applicant then has an opportunity to agree to that or disagree with that. And there's any number of conditions that usually less costly ones, simple ones that they'll say, yes, of course, I can change the curvature of that road a little bit, or I can change the color or things like that. Add more plantings that aren't controversial. But when you get to the more controversial items, like for example, the density, and you suggest that the project's density be moderated in some way, if the applicant says no, they can't just say, no, we don't want to do that. They have to say, no, we think that would make our project uneconomic. And you would then say, okay, then prove that. And they would have to produce the financial information, a pro forma, an analysis of a professional of some kind to demonstrate that by taking a floor off each of the buildings, again, for example, would make the project uneconomic. You then have an opportunity at that point, not any point prior, to hire your own financial consultant to test that. I will say from experience that the economics of 40B projects, as the state interprets them, are a bit of a shell game. It's not entirely real math, but there is enough room for disagreement that experts can differ. And you can and should rely on your expert if they disagree with the applicant. And then if the applicant is still unwilling to change their mind, then you have important decisions as we get down the stretch of this project where you can say, hey, we would really like to change this project by doing X. Again, removing a top story, changing it in some meaningful, large way. You could also deny the project if the applicant is unwilling to change. There's a significant distinction, though, between an approval with conditions and a denial. Now, sometimes the distinction can seem like it's somewhat meaningless given the overall failure rate of towns at the Housing Appeals Committee. But let's say you deny a project because you don't like the way it's designed and you don't feel it's your place to redesign it for the applicant. Then the only thing that is at issue at the Housing Appeals Committee, which is where the applicant would appeal to, and that's like an administrative court, but it's an administrative court that is strongly biased towards 40B developers. The only thing they would have to prove there is that it generally meets accepted standards for planning. Then the burden would shift to the board to demonstrate that no, in fact, there are significant impacts to the environment or public health and safety that overweigh the presumptive need to affordable housing. That's kind of the test on a denial. If, on the other hand, you took that project and you said, we're going to approve it, but it's going to be subject to the condition that you remove that top story on each of the buildings, reducing the density by 1/5 or however many units would be, and whatever other conditions you impose. Then the applicant's appeal to the Housing Appeals Committee would be different. Their first level of proof would be theirs. They would have to prove through witness testimony and evidence that the changes imposed by the board through the conditions of approval make the project uneconomic. If they can't make that proof, then the board wins regardless of the other, the merits of those conditions. So normally what an applicant will do is spend a significant amount of time and effort doing that. And again, we don't always fare that well, but there are some good arguments to be made on those issues. Then after the applicant presents their proof on it, we go through the normal review of, are these conditions necessary to serve the public good or protect the public health, safety, and welfare? So it's a slightly different version. There are some attorneys who do 40B work who will tell you in all circumstances that it's better to approve with conditions than to deny a project. Some boards will even take the position for like a 40, 60 unit project will approve 1 unit. You know, it just so it kind of creates a different kind of fight with the applicant. But there are also some boards that feel that it's more their role to serve on principle and just make the decision they feel they want to. If they want to approve it because they think it's a great project, by all means, do that. Or if they want to chop it up a little bit or make some significant conditions, by all means, do that. And if you can't in any way support a project, as I often say, I will not counsel on principle. I can't. And I think it's important that you stick to your principles. So if for some reason a project is proposed that you just can't wrap your hands around, even with significant conditions, then I would suggest, frankly, that you deny it. And I think that that's a smart way to go, not because you have any better chance of success on the merits, you don't, but sometimes the fight is worth having. And sometimes it's important as a board to stick up for you and your constituents and do what you need to do. And the other reason why I say that you should stick to your principles in whatever decision you make is, even if we don't win on a lot of these projects, if they end up in appeal, and we don't, towns historically lose a substantial portion of these. But what's interesting, even if you measure wins and losses, I would submit that if you measure the success of 40Bs by wins and losses at the Housing Appeals Committee, that's the wrong thing to look at. I participated in a study done by the real estate group at MIT a number of years ago. And what they found is that among all the projects that go through to the end at the Housing Appeals Committee or the courts, towns certainly lose about 90% of those appeals. However, the statistic is very different if you measure what is the outcome of all projects that are just appealed, that don't go to a final decision. And what they found is that 50% of those projects get resolved by either coming up with the settlement later or by a developer walking away. And that's real, and that really cuts the odds quite a bit. I'll give you kind of my basic feeling on that, and that is that developers need to make money. And they need, some of the big, large national developers, they maybe can, because they have so many projects going at once, they can support a lot of litigation, but developers don't like litigating. No one does. And it's expensive. And it's more expensive for the developers, by the way, than it is for the town. That's especially so in Southborough, where my fees for the town are built in. So the town pays no more extra for me litigating, whereas a developer will pay a fortune. So there is some benefit there to kind of press forward sometimes, because a developer then starts making dollars and cents decisions. Again, no one likes the fact that there's a process whereby we're using the litigation tools to essentially effectuate whether or not housing is done or not done. But sometimes there's good projects and sometimes there's bad projects. I don't have any conclusions about the project that's going to be before you, but I'm just speaking in hypotheticals. Oftentimes during that process, given the cost of litigation and the time that it takes, a developer will say, okay, hey, remember when you were talking about removing the top story of each of those buildings? Yeah, I think I could live with maybe half the buildings removing the top story, and I'll do these other improvements or whatever. And so sometimes we come up with good agreements. In other situations, the situation on the ground changes so radically that the projects become kind of essentially unfeasible. I'll give you an example of that. I was working on a project that was essentially getting built on a swamp in the town of Situate. And the town just couldn't see their way, the board just couldn't see their way around it, and they denied it. And it went through multiple levels of appeal, Housing Appeals Committee in the courts. And then just before all of the appeals were resolved, Hurricane Sandy came along. And as a result of that, FEMA changed all the flood maps up and down the East Coast, including for that site. And it made the project as proposed impossible. I'm not suggesting that that's something you hope for. I'm just saying that sometimes there are tools other than measuring results through the Housing Appeals Committee that you should be thinking about when you're strategizing with respect to how you're going to react to any particular project. Now, we all hope that people propose good projects. So if someone proposes a good project, this Park Central project could be that project. At the end of the day, they may satisfy you that this is providing good and affordable housing and won't impact on traffic or anything else like that. In which case, then the goal at the end of the 40B process is to come up with conditions, a lot of boilerplate stuff, but these decisions usually run 15 to 20 pages where we're going through a process of essentially figuring out how we're going to manage the construction of a project over a period of years, manage the affordable units on it, ensure that they provide the requisite mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the goal. And sometimes if we decide 50% of the way through the process that, hey, we can get behind this project, then we spend the latter half of the public hearing figuring out just how we're going to approve it in a way that makes the most sense from a construction standpoint. So that's kind of my rapid fire Cliff Notes version. There's a million shades of gray in this, but that's kind of how I approach these. Anyone have any questions? I know I said a lot in a very short period of time.
I have a question that is kind of on point. If we think we potentially have a conflict of interest and need to recuse, do we speak to you about that, or?
So you can. So there's two ways to go about conflict of interest, Jamie. The first is you can ask me. That's a slightly more formal way. If it's a very simple conflict thing, then maybe I can give you a quick answer by email or a phone call.
Okay.
If it's a little more complicated or you're a little concerned about it, the Ethics Commission has a lawyer of the day every day, and you can call them and you give them all the facts, and they will give you an answer on the spot usually as to whether or not you have a conflict. And even if they're wrong, you can rely on it. So, and they're seldom wrong. They're very good and they're very courteous, and they don't want people to get in trouble. If I have to write a formal opinion on your potential conflict, I have to make sure I file that with the town clerk, so it gets a little more formal, it becomes a little more public. So if you want to just have a quick conversation with the Ethics Commission, I generally recommend that. It's confidential. You do that, they clear you. And then if it comes up and someone says, hey, isn't Jamie conflicted? And you can say, no, I've talked with the Ethics Commission, I'm good.
Okay, sounds
And
good.
sometimes what they might say is, well, you're not conflicted, but there's this appearance, file this form. And, I can help you with that form.
Okay.
Jay, it's Craig. One thing that I would be interested in understanding is how to effectively manage the public comment periods. Even in our non-40B meetings, we sometimes have people get up that just, ramble and then step away and then come right back and ramble again. And, I've been in certain municipalities where you have one chance to speak, you have 2 minutes, say your piece about the project, and, let somebody else move forward and say with their piece.
Right.
How can we, I'm not saying that that's the direction we should go, but where's the happy median so that we can allow people to talk, be respectful, get the feedback, but not get into, I'm going to sit up here and I'm going to talk for 15 minutes and say everything under the sun as to why I do or don't like the project.
Right. So just by way of background, I've been both a board chair of a board in my town and I'm currently and have been for the last decade or so, the moderator in my town. So I have some personal experience, but also as a lawyer, I often counsel and give seminars on just this topic. One thing I'd like to say is that a lot of this is stylistic. The conduct and flow and tempo, the length of a public hearing is very much up to the chair of the board. Board chairs have different styles in terms of what they'll allow, what they won't, how structured. Everything has to go through me. Don't speak unless you've been spoken to, things like that, or much more casual approaches. I would never endeavor to tell a chair that their style is wrong or right. If a board though says, hey, we need to get a hold on this, then there are some tools at your disposal. And I think it's helpful when a board chair does lay some ground rules down, especially for a project that's going to likely last many months and go over the course of many hearings. So I could envision something at the beginning saying like, folks, we're going to be at this for quite a while. If you're a member of the public and you want to speak on this because you have an opinion or you have some facts to present, I'm more interested in facts than your opinion. But if you want to do that, you are going to get an opportunity to do that. But we're going to be at this for a while, so I'm only going to devote, say, the last half hour or hour of any particular meeting to this. I want people to be quick. If you have something highly technical or you want to make a presentation, you can ask for that. But generally, I want people to speak for just a couple minutes. And if it goes on longer, I may move you along. If I see a lot of repetitive stuff, I may say, does anyone have anything new? If I see the conversation tilting in one way, I may ask if there's a contrary opinion. But I do reserve the right to cut you off if you're going on too long. I won't permit anything bombastic or personal. And if you are repetitive, I may say that, we've got it. And, to ask someone else if they can speak. And that's all okay. People will say, I have the right to speak as long as I want. And we're all as much a free speech advocate as anyone else, but that's not exactly true in the course of a public hearing, because otherwise they'd all be filibustered. So you have an opportunity to do that. You may want to set an expectation for each of these meetings. You're all volunteers. You all have other things you want to do in your life. You may say, look, folks, we're going to do this 2 hours a session. I think after that, after you've worked a full day, and they're going through what could be a fairly controversial hearing, That's more than generous. It's hard to focus when you get to that 9:30, 10 o'clock when you started your day at 8 or 9 o'clock and have just been going. I have no problem with having those kind of constraints. I think it's helpful and healthy, and you can structure it that way. So you have a lot of tools. You can really moderate debate and keep things moving in a way that still guarantees people's rights to speak. And if it gets to be 9:30 and that was your cutoff point, say folks, we're going to wind this up. If you were ready to speak, you're going to get a chance next time. Please keep coming to these meetings. We value your opinion. That kind of thing. And sometimes you don't have to, as I mentioned at the beginning, you don't have to allow public comment at every meeting. Let's say, for example, that traffic was a major issue in the project before you, and you were going to have their traffic consultant followed by your traffic consultant, then comments from you, and then maybe some civil engineering. You may say, look, folks, this is going to be like a 2-hour discussion on traffic alone tonight. We're going to get through that. And I ask that you hold your comments and please come to the next session. So each particular session of the public hearing is not a public hearing unto itself. All that's guaranteed to members of the public is that they get a chance to meaningfully state their piece during the public hearing at large. Now, I wouldn't say we're going to allow 20 minutes at the end of a 6-month public hearing, but if you are spending an inordinate amount of time on one issue, feel free to confine it to that and say, next session is going to be all public comment. Gear up, that's what we're doing, or something like that. You have those options.
What about, I know I've emailed a lot of town boards. Can we suggest that? Or, if you email to the board, everyone on the board will see it type situation?
Yeah, certainly, you can't, you're certainly free to say, look, if you want to put your comments in writing by email, we will see it. That doesn't mean you have to read every email aloud. In fact, I recommend that you don't. You might want to say, hey, we received a ton of emails, most of them, related to this issue. They're in each of the board members' packets. We'll all take a look at that. It's all part of the public record. But yeah, absolutely. People should feel free. If they don't already know that they can do that, then they absolutely can. And they'll just be added to all of the comments that you'll otherwise take into consideration at the end of the day. Here too, again, for this project, it's just my expectation, knowing its history, that there's going to be at least one, if not 2 or 3 or 4 attorneys that represent people that are probably going to want to talk. They're no different than a member of the public. Sometimes us attorneys think that we're a little more important than we are, but they should be treated no differently. I kind of like the idea, if one person is going to speak instead of 15 or 20, great, especially if they're pertinent, but they're entitled to no more courtesy or privilege than any other member of the public. If they're droning on, if they're getting bombastic or pointing personal fingers, then you have all the same rights to quash that as you do with a member of the public.
And most likely the attorney's written down their comments beforehand.
Yeah, generally, I'm already predicting that at least the identity of a couple of attorneys here, good attorneys, and they're very careful with their words. So I imagine they will know what to say when the time arrives.
Jay, the experts on civil engineering, finance, or traffic, or whatever, that go through some of our resources in town. You go back to the planning board or the building department to say, who are our options for those experts?
You can certainly, the planning board or the Conservation Commission or some other entities may have some good advice on that. And for engineers that know the town well, or traffic consultants that know the town well. So Karina could be a good resource for who they've used, but you're not obliged to.
Right.
If you felt, or perhaps if I felt that there was a particular issue, and I know of a particular traffic consultant who's very strong on that subject, you can go another way. Sometimes an applicant will say, I want you to use that engineer because they've looked at this before and, you know, it'll be more cost effective. That's certainly fair, and it's a fair request, but you're not required to do that. I've also worked with dozens and dozens and dozens of engineers and traffic consultants, so I'm also happy to make suggestions. But yeah, if there's people that know, that are known to the planning board, the Concom, the fire department, the whoever, for these things, then yeah, if there's some economy and expediency to be had by using them, then absolutely.
Would
And I
there
hope
be-
too that
Go
that
ahead.
folks like the planning board are going to be not shy when, or the other boards or other departments are going to be not shy when expressing their concerns or statements of approval with respect to any aspect of the project.
How do we best effectuate getting comments and inputs from the various boards ahead of these meetings? You know, I know in my experience in going through other municipalities, there's a lot of coordination through, you know, typically a housing department because they're larger than what we have, but that really does kind of get the plans and the ideas and the concepts to the various departments, coordinates responses, gets them to the zoning board so that there's kind of a staff memo, so to speak, you know, listing out what the other boards who would normally, but for 40B, you know, have this in front of them. You know, how do we make sure we get their comments early as opposed to, you know, thrown in at the last minute
So Craig, shouldn't our consultant be working with us on that? No, on kind of, you know, to me, that's what a 40B consultant is really helpful for, is to try to bird dog a lot of that. So that was when I heard that this was coming back up. That was my first question. I go, who's our consultant?
What 40B consultant?
Yeah,
You don't have a 40B. I mean,
Not
we-
every-
Mass Housing Partnership does provide technical assistance through the,
It's the, there's a term that maybe it's not a consultant, maybe it's a,
well, there's technical assistance, but that is not necessarily a dedicated person to shepherd the process
no,
along.
and I actually don't recommend that you use the Mass Housing Partnership technical assistance grants.
no, that's not what I was thinking of.
But I mean, your town planner, I would hope, I mean, they're all going to get copies. All of the relevant boards and departments are going to get copies of the application. My thought would be that when that application comes in, that perhaps the board writes a memo, quick memo to the board, said, hey, we're opening up this hearing on such and such a date. We invite and encourage your participation. We'd like to hear from you early and often during this process. Sometimes other boards don't show up and make themselves heard. I would hope that they would here. I know that the planning board's very active and is likely, I would hope, comment on this. They certainly had strong feelings about the prior project, so I would hope that they would have strong feelings again, either positive or negative, about the project. I'm assuming the select board will be involved. I think a key person or key people you want to get involved are the police and fire chief. Emergency access is a major issue in every 40B project, especially where access is somewhat unique in terms of the road system or the project configuration. So I think it's vital that the fire chief be encouraged to speak and let their feelings be heard on this.
So the mechanism is to invite them to come to the hearing and participate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hope they would anyway, but absolutely.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be also excellent for them to supply us with their comments formally, not just arrive at the meeting and speak. I mean, they have access to plans and,
We'll take what we can get.
yeah.
You know, one element of, say, just taking that last piece first, the fire chief, it's going to be overwhelmingly likely that early on in the project, we're going to ask the applicant, if they haven't already done so already, identify where the hydrants are going to be, identify how the town's largest fire truck is going to navigate the site, and identify the quality of the emergency water flows and how they're going to access all four sides and the roof of every building. And the applicant will do that. We can send that to our civil engineer, but we also want to make sure that they that we get the advice of the fire department. We may want to even ask an applicant. We can't ask them to go to the planning board, but we could ask them, like, hey, have you spoken to the fire chief? And if they say no, we said, well, before the next hearing comes around, we'd like you to make an appointment with the fire chief and talk to him about whatever it is, fire alarms, hydrants, fire flow, building access, emergency access by the vehicles, those kinds of things. And very often an applicant will say, sure, we'll get our engineer down to the fire department next week.
I know we
But
can't
that's,
ask them
that's a
to,
reasonable thing to do, that, to ask for their comments on what they're seeing in the plans thus far, and just receive them as comments, not necessarily in a public forum.
Whatever, yeah.
Yeah.
Again, you'll have a lot on your plate. However they want to, obviously written, thorough comments that are expertly produced are things we'd love to see. But really, the more information we get from people with an area of expertise or concern about this, the better off we'll be. Whatever form they take, again, we appreciate professionally done reports and good, clear, and concise testimony every time. But if all they can give us is a few words of wisdom, we'll take that too. Just don't, put your head in the ground. Please help us, because this is a big project. Or even if this was a small project, it's still an important project and we can't do it alone. That's the message, is where, it kind of takes a village message.
Okay. Okay. So the bottom line is we have the right to deny or approve with conditions. And it's just like almost anything else, they have the right to then appeal. It's just in a 40B, they have a greater likelihood of winning, right?
Yeah, and part of what I'm, I'll be there with you, and I'll be there to kind of act as a sounding board, or maybe make a few suggestions based on my experience. And if I see it going in a particular direction, or if you tell me it's going in a particular direction, then I'm going to help you start building a decision that's as defensible as possible. Whether it's an approval that an abutter is going to appeal, a denial that an applicant's going to appeal, or a set of conditions that the applicant appeals in part or an abutter appeals. So, I'm going to make sure that we draft a decision that's amply supported by the facts that are presented to you. My feeling, having done this, for more than 2 decades of getting beaten up about 40B projects, is make the decision you want to make. Sometimes that involves compromise. Sometimes it involves standing on principle. I think that we'll find a way to make it a strong decision that you can get behind and be proud of, and then let the lawyers do their job, let the market do its job, and see where it comes out.
Okay. And so are you planning on being in attendance for the hearings, John Jay?
My goal would be to be at every single one. If I'm not there, then someone from my office will be.
Sorry, you did say that.
Yeah, there's 6 or 7 of us that have done a lot of 40B work. As I'm the most familiar face to Southborough, I think it's likely that it'll be me, at least for most of the hearings. If it's not, you're going to get someone with a ton of experience, one of my other partners likely. But my goal would have it be me. So we'll work on scheduling as it gets there. It doesn't have to be on a set schedule. You all have lives too. There's going to be scheduling messes all over the place. We'll get at some point, we're going to run into summer schedules or holiday schedules. It'll be a mess, but we'll keep a quorum together, and we'll work through it. It's going to be a long haul for a project of this size. Even if this was a little project, they have their own complexities as well, but we'll all work together. And we design the schedule. An applicant can never tell you, hey, we want to meet every 2 weeks. Doesn't work like that. If you all want to meet every 2 weeks and plow through this, that's great. My general feeling as someone who's volunteered a lot of my time in my own town and who sees the weight of volunteerism on all of you all is once a month is fine. It's complicated. You have lives and other things you have to do. So if this was 6 months and there were 6 meetings, we'd get it done. If it's not, if you want to meet, if we have to throw in a special meeting here and there, fine. But let's work on your schedule for sure.
Yeah, I'm also an advocate for not going much longer than 2 hours as well, because I have, maybe not as much as Paul has, but I've been on some meetings that go late and you're pretty tapped by the end. So it's not the right time to be making critical decisions.
No, nobody does their best work after 9 if they've already been up 12, at working for 12 hours. So it's just the nature of it.
So this question it's not actually related to the project. It's basically related to any 40B project that would come through Southborough. Multifamily housing is not, to the scale that any 40B project would be looking at, part of our zoning code. So that's going to ultimately be a use variance where the town specifically stripped that from us. However, in 40B, my understanding is we're the permit granting authority for any variance that's needed. How is that going to be addressed or communicated to the public that, yes, this is the right forum for it?
So there's really no such thing as variances under 40B, obviously. There's waivers of local bylaws. They will come in with a waiver request from the local bylaws chief, among them the waiver of a prohibition against multifamily housing of this type. And then, to the extent the public needs an education of what's going on, and very often, especially if there's been a decent gap in time between applications, people will saying like, well, it says in our zoning bylaws they can't do this. So we get involved in a little bit of public education along the way. It's never perfect, but I'll be there to help with that. But it's a communication thing. Most people, especially people that were affected, but in this project by the prior version of it, are going to have at least some grounding in what 40B is and isn't, and how it works and its function and dysfunction. But just have to be patient with people. I mean, to the extent that they're courteous, that I guess we'll extend every courtesy back.
Correct.
Would it make sense to have some, maybe at the opening hearing, a kind of a primer on 40B and what?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to deliver that. If I think I could do even a much shorter Cliff Notes version than I did tonight, just kind of on what our expectations are, and then the chair can explain how the board is going to have ebbs and flows and what those ebbs and flows are going to be during the course of the hearing.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Yeah, I think that and then something from David on kind of what our process, those expectations of, during the public comment period, we will let you speak for, a certain amount of time or whatever the case might be. But if we see you doing A or B or C, we reserve the right to, just setting the ground rules kind of upfront. And
Right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely the way to do it so that they understand it. So that when they do go astray, you can say, this is what I established and you didn't follow it. So I think I have the right.
yeah.
Okay. Paul, you don't have any questions? You were too involved in the last one.
Yeah, geez, I'm really looking forward to this again.
No sarcasm detected.
So I sort of do have a question. This might be kind of silly. Why is this in front of us again?
Because they have a right to do it.
But if it was approved, whatever, a couple of years ago, and I know there were various appeals and the such, so is the approval no longer valid?
The court threw it out, not because of
Because
anything.
during the appeal process. So
Yeah,
then
not because of anything the board did per se. The 40B side, the court validated the legitimacy of the board's decision on the 40B elements. It was the quirky issue with the kind of variance wrapped inside of the 40B that eventually caused its demise. Thought it was an interesting approach to it. I only came into it on the back end because I was just becoming town council, although I was certainly familiar with the project, having served as special counsel to the town a little bit during that at that point. I thought the Park Central folks were going to appeal and take it to the next level. They chose not to.
appeal the appeal.
Yeah, you can go. They had one, maybe two more levels of appeal left. So that was a trial court decision. They could have gone to the appeals court and then potentially the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts after that. So they chose not to. I think they thought their better path would be to revise the project a little bit and then just file a new application.
Okay. And there was two components originally, a 40B component, a 40A component. Is the 40A going to be back in play again, or just the 40B?
We don't have the application yet.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. So we're all.
The only thing I've seen is a 40B component on the project eligibility application. It looks like a pretty straightforward collection of large garden style apartment buildings. So I don't know if they want to do a 40A component on some other element of the property, but it looks like it's straight 40B from here on out.
Is the 40A component still approved?
That's an interesting question. I think ostensibly it might be, because the court didn't rule on the variance, on the legitimacy of the variance. They just ruled on, and again, I only came into it late, that the 40B couldn't be based upon the variance in some way, shape, or form. But looking at the application, it does not appear that there's any interest in doing anything but a 40B project here. But I could be wrong.
Mike, to answer your question from a little bit ago about a 40B.
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to that.
Yeah, so there was a very nice gentleman that worked with us as, in I guess working for the, advising the town, advising the board. I cannot remember his name for the life of me, but he was very nice to work with. He was I thought very helpful in advising us, and thought he was very helpful in the flow of the meetings too, actually.
So let me take some guesses. So it could have been, let's see, it was a gentleman, you said?
Yes.
I'm going to guess. So there's Joe Pesnola. There's Dean Harrison.
No.
Trying to think of some of the others that are out there doing like 40B consultancy. It wouldn't have been Paul Haverty, Ed Marchand.
Ed Marchand.
Okay, so Ed, I believe, is retired. He was a
Okay.
consultant that was involved through the Mass Housing Partnership technical consultant, and those are all good, talented people. But my concern about Mass Housing Partnership is that their marching orders are to facilitate an approval. And I'm not ready to prejudge that this is an approval. They're all good and they're all smart. I think that ultimately they're not going to do anything more than someone from my office. I'm not tooting my own horn. I don't need extra nights out if I could cede it to someone else. I just don't think they're not acting as an advocate. Their 40B knowledge base is excellent, but you're going to get as much 40B knowledge base from us.
Yeah,
and
so
you're going to get advocacy as well.
So when I was leaving the board in Grafton, zoning board of appeals, we had a 40B, and we had a consultant. I don't remember. My impression was a private consultant hired by the town to help the ZBA deal with all of the competing interests, the planning, the Concom, all of those details. And it was a private third-party consultant that kind of helped run between the boards and to get the project kind of streamlined, moving. And again, my experience with that was very limited, but I remember it was a woman and she was really like helping facilitate all.
Maybe Judy Barrett was her name.
This is.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. And there may be some issues where we hire kind of more of a planner type, kind of a holistic person to on basic site planning issues, and they can be very helpful in that regard at the applicant's expense.
Yeah, because it's specifically the site plan where I can say for myself, like, I don't do site plan reviews. So it's that's the shoe that doesn't fit with respect to having the ZBA handle projects.
So one thing that we may want to look at when we go to hire a civil engineering firm is that we hire a civil engineering firm that also has on its staff AICP, so a certified planner that can help us with basic site planning as well, and use that during the peer review, because it's not all civil engineering is not all stormwater and utility design and drainage design and all that. A good civil engineering firm will have someone who can help with some of the slightly more esoteric side of the site development process. So there are some firms that I could recommend that would be value added to that. And, again, all at the applicant's expense.
Craig, you see way more of this than I do. You know what I'm talking about, or am I just nuts? Which is always a strong possibility. Always out there, Mike.
I'm not as familiar with what you're talking about, mainly because the municipalities I deal with are larger and kind of have their own staff.
Got
So
it.
they have
Okay.
a 20-person planning staff with a planner that is in charge of coordinating comments on 40Bs and.
Got it.
Or there's
Okay.
like a regional planning authority on the vineyard that has, again, the staff that goes through that whole process that then basically looks at all the planning related stuff before it goes to the zoning board.
Got
Boy,
it.
I would love in this process to be able to refer this to a Martha's Vineyard Commission like thing and have them spend the next 6 months rather than us reviewing this. That would be great.
I'd sign up for that.
Yeah.
So I'm in front of them on a couple of things right now.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a big project down the vineyard right now that I'm working on.
Oh,
Went through a very turf field, went through a very rigorous review at the MVC.
okay. Yep. So,
Anything else we want to hit on?
And I'm around too. I mean, people, I'm pretty easy to get in contact with, and certainly the select board supports you all staying in contact with me because everyone wants this to go the right way.
Right.
So
Actually, that brings up a question. I know in the past, there's been a desire to have our request to reach out to you go through Mark Purple. Once this starts, are we still going to need to do that, or are we going to have? Well,
no,
David will be the contact point. It's not like all of us can send these things, but to limit the flow of communication.
Yeah,
But
it'd be, good point. It'd be a lot more efficient.
yeah, no, well, once I've been assigned to a matter, you don't have to cycle it through Mark anymore.
okay, that's Paul. Paul, mute yourself. You're echoing. Okay, that's good. And then I think as a group, we should agree that things go through David as a flow of communication to.
However you all want to do it, my only concern is going to be it can't be the centerpiece for serial conversation about the same subject, because we'll get in open meeting law stuff. If a member had a burning question, Jamie mentioned before about conflicts, or if you just had a burning question about, hey, someone said this about traffic, I don't understand it. What's your sense of this? Or, and you had to ask me. I mean, I'll leave how you want to channel that if you want to have it go all through one person. I'm never not going to respond to an important email, even if it's like, I can't talk to you inside the open meeting law about this, or this can wait till the meeting, but I'll always respond to emails. So.
Okay.
I think I'm good for now. I do appreciate the support that you're going to provide.
Actually, I have one last question. What sort of onus or responsibilities is Laura going to have for us in terms of documenting, distributing? Like, what is her role going to be, and what does she need to be prepared for as our new assistant?
Yeah.
I mean, she's new to us to begin with, and then new to this
our
too.
new assistant Laura.
So
What does she sign herself up
Laura's
for?
gonna have to be essentially superhuman. We're talking about wearing a cape and developing superpowers somewhere along the way. This obviously, you need someone. The applicant's going to submit plans, those plan reports before a meeting. I think you should make a rule when the applicant is submitting something that if it's not submitted a week before a hearing, then you're not going to consider it. So for whether it's an engineering report or a new set of plans or expert report on something, you should tell the applicant in between sessions that you have to give it to us for a week prior or however many days prior. So Laura would then collect that information, be the central point for it. And then it'll all go out to you all and myself as well. And she'll probably collect the correspondence and get it out to you, obviously help us with scheduling and things like that. But, we want to make sure that we don't heap too much on her. And we also want to make sure that we stay on the right side of the open meeting law regarding communications through her office and through Katie and through other folks like that. So, but having that level of support is really helpful, because it, rather than a chairperson having to juggle their day job and disseminate information, it's helpful to have dedicated staff for sure. So let's just be mindful that she's a human being too, and this is going to be a busy project.
Laura, do you have any questions? No. Okay.
No, not yet. I'm sure I will have plenty as time goes on. So.
Yeah, I'm sure I will too.
Great. Questions are good.
Okay.
All right, Paul.
Okay, Paul, where are you?
What, is it my turn?
It is your turn.
Jay, just say no, I'm the official ender of the meetings usually.
Nice. I like that. Every board needs one.
So
Yeah.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to adjourn for the second. All in favor, respond with aye. Mike,
Aye.
Craig,
Aye.
Doris,
Aye.
Paul,
Oh, yes.
and Jamie.
Aye.
And Williams, aye. Thank you very much, Jay. We appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks,
for
Jay.
your time
Jay.
this evening.
Yep. We'll see you all soon.
Yeah, see you soon.
See, we'll be
Thanks.
seeing a lot more of each other, that's for sure.
See the rest of
Yeah.
you next week.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right.
True, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Correct,
We'll
right?
see.
We have a regular meeting next week, right?
That's
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Very
Judy.
Aye.